Did the sanctions stop Iran's support for terrorism or its quest for nuclear weapons? No, but it weakened its economy dramatically and thus its ability to fund its efforts. Of course, direct military action by Israel and U.S. help, China's efforts seem short-sighted in either case. Unless war starts soon, the U.S. has the resources and the will, at least this administration does, to ramp up domestic production in the medium term. China, Russia, and India do not make up a coherent economic unit. Those three countries are unified only in their resistance to the U.S.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're all happy and healthy along with your respected families, wherever you're located on this God's green earth. Welcome to today's episode of the Real Talks with Amini, and I'm honored to have Professor Ivan Hillebrand, a former professor of Geoeconomics at University of Kentucky, as well as senior analyst at Central Intelligence Agency. And I was honored to be his student during my time studying my master's degree through a Fulbright scholarship at University of Kentucky, Patterson School of Diplomacy. And we will talk with him about various aspects of the geopolitical situation, global trends and events that are happening right now in the world, and also what are his predictions about the future, mostly. Dr. Hillebrand, thank you so much for accepting to be on the show. I'm honored to have you. You've had a significant career in policy as well as in academics, and you have written books and articles. We're glad to have you on the show. So maybe we can start by getting your assessment about the future global trend, the power, the global power trend. You have studied it for so many years. What do you think is gonna happen? Are we entering into a multipolar type situation in the world, or you think still the U.S. has the necessary leverages compared to its competitors in the world?
Thanks, Sadiq. I'm an economist as well as a geopolitical analyst. And when you think about the global power balance, you really need some measure of power. And when I was at the CIA and later at the University of Kentucky, working with the International Futures Model, hereafter called IFS, we came up with all sorts of quantitative measures, creating indexes, weighting GDP, GDP per capita. That's the measure of technology in our thinking, population, defense spending, and other things that are measurable. That was a while ago. I left Kentucky 10 years ago. But I looked at the IFS model recently, and it currently shows China's share of global power rising to 2040, U.S. relative power declining to below Chinese levels, way below Chinese levels, and Russia with very low ranking. That's interesting. And I worked on that kind of model and that kind of thinking, but how meaningful is it really? Even if the measures are good, how good are the forecasts of population, GDP, and the other measured index? How do we know what they're going to be in 2030 or 2040? But there's an even bigger problem than that. Ray Klein, a former intelligence analyst and later a leader in the government, CIA and National Security Council, put two intangibles into the equation: strategic purpose and national will. He included things like GDP and population and military capability like we did, but when he added those relative terms up, he multiplied them by the sum of strategic purpose, meaning the clarity and effectiveness of national strategy, and national will, the political will of the leadership, but public support to pursue strategic goals. The first three terms are similar to the work in IFS, subject to the same criticism. The last two, which I think are critical, and we didn't include in our old work, aren't measurable at all. It's all guesswork. If you want to think about China, Russia, and the US, China has the advantage over the US in strategic purpose and national will. Russia has a clear strategic purpose, but it's not clear how deep the Russian national will to power goes in the populace. The U.S. strategic purpose right now is in flux. Should we maintain the status quo in a globalized world order or resist the rise of new powers by all the elements of statecraft? My co-author and I wrote about this choice 10 years ago in our book, Energy, Economic Growth, and Geopolitical Futures. Behind our thinking was the power transition theory, a concept developed by Organsky and Kugler and many others. According to this theory, a rising power, think China in the 21st century or the US in the 19th century, think of them as catching up rapidly in the measurable elements of power with the current hegemon, the US in the 21st century or Great Britain in the 19th century. This catch-up creates a dangerous situation. Either the rising power acquiesces to the hegemon's power, being satisfied with its enhanced position, or it continues to rise, and the former hegemon accepts its decline peacefully, the way Great Britain did, or else there's great power war. In Kugler's work, the most dangerous period is when the rising power approaches 80% of the power of the old hegemon. Writing in 2015, we estimated that this would occur between 2021 and 2025. In 2015, when we wrote the book, we asked a number of academics and government experts to help us think about how the impending power transition might play out. In a series of 8 scenarios, most of the experts thought the US would continue a path of globalization, expecting or hoping that China would be satisfied or intimidated into being satisfied. No one anticipated how dissatisfied with the old order China seems to be, or how disruptive a new US president might be. That was work from a long time ago, but nothing's been clarified in more recent work. Jonathan Zinn, in the December 2025 issue of Foreign Affairs, claims that China's governance is so effective, so superior, so resilient that it'll probably overcome all its difficulties and continue on a path to hegemony. Yang Huan, I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly, also writing for the Council of Foreign Relations, takes the opposite tack, saying that China's power may have peaked already. That internal weakness of the Chinese system and the Chinese economy will prevent it from ever overtaking the United States. So 2 very divergent views from the same august body, the Council. It's still all guesswork because no one can predict for sure the future values of those 5 determinants of national power.
Yeah. And so what do you think, given the simultaneous challenges of Ukraine, the situation in the Middle East, as well as the growing tensions in Indo-Pacific and the rising terrorism threat, do you think the United States has the capability, the political and economic capability to maintain its leadership in all multiple fronts at once?
It depends on one's assumed values in the power calculation outlined in the first answer. In the medium term, I think the US has the 3 quantifiable power terms: GDP, population, and the military capability to maintain hegemony and keep a semblance of big power peace. On strategic purpose and national will, I'm not so sure. The strategic purpose of the Trump administration seems fairly clear. Rely on US economic and military strength and cultivate willing allies abroad. The administration shows a profound distrust in multilateral institutions to keep the peace. I'm not so sure about the national will. Trump and his leadership team have the will to follow through on this purpose, but will the public at large support his vision? What about a potential Democrat Party administration? The strategic purpose would return to a more multilateral approach with more carrots than sticks. Would it return to a diversity as our strength military? In that scenario, China's rise to hegemony is more likely, unless its underlying economic and demographic problems undermine its economic and military prowess. when the Indian administration let U.S. hegemony gradually and peacefully fade away, the way of Great Britain that acquiesced to the U.S. rise a century ago. I don't take Russia very seriously in the quest for hegemony. Russia can certainly pressure its former captive states, but its military and economic strength do not and will not make it a great power again. Its current power would diminish further if the EU or key member states refine their strategic purpose and bucked up their national will.
So, in your book, the energy, economic growth, and geopolitical futures with Dr. Clausen, you explore how energy shapes global power. So, how do you see a changing landscape in energy sector from renewables to critical minerals affecting the U.S. Geopolitical leverage in the next decade?
Well, the U.S. is energy independent, has a great advantage. China's energy insecurity has long been a factor in its foreign policy. Zhang in 2006 wrote that, and I'm quoting, China cannot have control over its development goals without corresponding control over the resources that fuel the economy. Mm-hmm. China is almost helpless to protect its overseas oil import routes. It is forced to entrust its fate to others. Now, we thought China could rely on the global economy and open markets, which we assume optimistically in 4 of our 8 scenarios in the book, or could take a much more aggressive action to gain physical or diplomatic control of offshore energy. It could also build up its fleet and staff its overseas bases. Mm-hmm. The bellicose trade policy of the current U.S. administration does nothing to encourage China to rely on globalization, but the rapid expansion of China's naval forces and its aggressive economic statecraft long predate this administration. In the long run, China's energy insecurity depends on many factors beyond its control. Fears about peak oil have subsided, but if oil and gas become harder to find and prices rise, acquiring preferential access to oil becomes more important to China. Windmills and solar power will never erase China's vulnerability, but nuclear power might. Safe and cost-effective nuclear power could reduce global tensions immeasurably.
Mm-hmm. Professor Hillebrand, you also taught economic statecraft for years. So from your perspective, given the resistance to sanctions in some parts of the world, and also efforts by China, Russia, and India against US dollar dominance, what do you think the effectiveness of sanctions as an effective US foreign policy tool these days?
Well, were they ever effective? Mm-hmm. We studied Gary Huckbauer's Economic Sanctions Reconsidered and Daniel Dresner's The Sanctions Paradox, and the conclusions in both these books was not very encouraging. I see that Dresner claims in a recent foreign policy article that his theory about sanctions success and failure holds up pretty well. That's what he claims. Mm-hmm. Holds up pretty well in the recent Russian episode. Mm-hmm. In quotes, the US-led financial and trade sanctions against Russia contributed to negative economic growth, spiking interest rates, and higher inflation, end quote. Well and good, but when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of the Ukraine and made it a fight for territory, sanctions alone could never be expected to work. But Dresner goes on to say that sanctions are useful nonetheless, and that they should be ratcheted up today because it weakens Russia's ability to prosecute a long-term war. And this idea of pressuring the rival certainly has been the case with trade and financial sanctions on Iran. Do the sanctions stop Iran's support for terrorism or its quest for nuclear weapons? No, but it weakened its economy dramatically and thus its ability to fund its efforts. Of course, direct military action by Israel and the U.S. helped, but some academics say the recent bombing of Iran's nuclear sites would lead to war, but that hasn't happened. And it seems likely that economic coercion has played a large part in Iran's subdued response. I don't know if Brezhnev would claim that as a victory for his methodology, but I do. Can sanctions cause war? There's an old argument that U.S. sanctions against Japan in the 1930s pushed Japan into a resource security dilemma and caused Japan to first invade China and then attack the United States. President Trump's round of tariffs and tariff bluffs and threats was in part to damage China's economic power and to restrict its geopolitical rise. Does it make war more or less likely? I don't know. China doesn't limit its economic statecraft to trade and financial matters. It has built a web of financial dependencies in third world countries by investment, purchases, and political bribery. Its quest to monopolize rare earth metals and their processing started years ago, notably in its efforts to make California's Mountain Pass mine unprofitable. Its latest move to restrict exports of rare earth metals to the world, not just the US, is a display of raw coercive power, or maybe it's just a bargaining chip. But China's effort seems short-sighted in either case. Unless war starts soon, the US has the resources and the will, at least this administration does, to ramp up domestic production in the medium term. So I think the answer to your question is that sanctions can be an effective tool of statecraft and, less likely, can lead to war. Mm-hmm. You mentioned de-dollarization by our adversaries. These haven't gotten very far and won't, as long as the US stays the largest trading and financial power. The trade policy of the current administration and eagerness to impose financial sanctions by this and preceding administrations will probably help to decrease the dollar's role.
Yeah. Well, I do agree on that. And I think this administration is very serious in terms of blocking any efforts to undermine US dollar, which is we can appreciate their strong stance on that, at least on BRICS and other regional groupings. This question is for our audience who are interested on the Afghanistan question. We can take it in a larger context. Given after 20 years of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, what do you think the U.S. policymakers, what lessons should they draw from state building, from development and local legitimacy while engaging in a fragile state?
Now we're getting away from my expertise, and I can only offer my opinions.
Of course.
Most of what I know about Afghanistan, I learned from you and other Afghani students. But it seems to me that policymakers of both parties understand now to keep away from state building in tribal societies without a strong national history. President Trump offers diplomatic advice and statecraft pressures to bring parties together. And he's had amazing success in Africa and Southeast Asia. But he is loath to spend much money or use the US military in cases where others have rushed troops. Libya is an interesting story. The US aided the downfall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. It was Obama's concept of war. No boots, no quagmire, no long-term US involvement, but there was also no plan for peace when civil war erupted. The US ambassador was killed in Benghazi in a strange effort to funnel arms to one faction in the resulting civil war. Mm-hmm. So the result of undermining a reasonably competent dictator who was no great threat to the US was instability and terrorism in Libya, terror spreading into Mali and Niger, and waves of migrants fleeing the violence. Obama himself has called it his biggest mistake as president. Trump picking fights with Maduro in Venezuela and Petro in Colombia might be a precursor to an Obama-like intervention in Libya, but I hope not. Mm-hmm. You mentioned development, and again, that's not my expertise, but it seems to me with a few $1 billion a year of US money, most of which went to US contractors, little could be expected of actual economic development springing from the US effort. And little was accomplished. In recent years, economic development seemed de-emphasized in favor of changing people's attitudes on social issues, and that didn't work very well. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much for that response, Dr. Hillebrand. Appreciate that. Some argue that we are entering a phase where it's the end of globalization, or some say, on the other hand, that it's a reconfiguration. From your modeling work, looking at the future, how do you see the global trade and economic interdependence evolving, and how does it and what does it mean for U.S. competitiveness?
I don't know what people mean when they say end of globalization. End suggests no international trade, no international flows of capital or ideas or people. But there's always been a high degree of international trade, from the days of ancient Egypt to the truly global trade regime of Imperial Britain. There always will be such trade because it makes so much economic sense. But it'll probably be less fully integrated than people who are optimistic about a peaceful power transition thought possible. China's saber rattling across the Taiwan Strait, its mercantilist policies aiming towards monopolization of rare earth metals, fears about supply chain responsibility, which rose dramatically during the COVID era, all tend to diminish the rush to just-in-time factory processes that depend on the smooth flow of goods across tremendous distances from sometimes hostile foreign powers. Another problem is the glories of the theory of comparative advantage don't seem so compelling anymore. The powerful assumptions that make it work don't all apply now, if they ever did. It has been shown that one's comparative advantage can be lost to a nimble competitor. Intensive globalization makes economic sense in a peaceful world, but doesn't make nearly as much sense in a world of contending great powers. China and the US can make themselves less dependent on foreign trade, but China will have to make big adjustments to its economy to reduce its dependence on exports. The US too can reduce its trade interdependence for economic security reasons, but that effort will raise prices and reduce living standards. So for both great powers, there is a natural constraint on how far deglobalization can go. I don't put much stock in regionalization. Small countries need to interact with the great powers, not just themselves. China, Russia, and India do not make up a coherent economic unit. Those three countries are unified only in their resistance to the US. Only Western Europe as a whole is big enough and technologically advanced enough to stand on its own, but it's constrained by its dependence on foreign energy and will be loath to give up the economic advantages of foreign trade. So I would say globalization is dead in the Thomas Friedman Lexus and olive tree concept that he wrote in a very important book in 1999, where the theory of comparative advantage and the forces of global capitalism will automatically, we don't have to do anything, we don't have to have a national strategy, they'll automatically force all countries into a harmonious global community. Reconfiguration is a better descriptor as the pressure of great power competition reduces the incentives to integrate.
Yeah. Well, Professor Hillebrand, looking ahead, what type of U.S. foreign policy model do you suggest the U.S. Is in need to navigate this new era, one that is marked by economic competition to technological disruption, as well as the rising authoritarianism?
Well, there's always been economic competition and there's always been technological disruption, although maybe it's happening at a faster pace now. But I don't see any rising authoritarian alliances. If you mean China, Russia, and India, India is a democracy, and Chinese and Russian interests diverge dramatically in the not so long run. A good strategy for the US would be to play off these diverging interests to keep alliance at bay. Globalization is dead in the sense of the way Thomas Friedman wrote about it. It was never realistic and did great harm to the US long-term position. And I remember when he came to the agency and lectured on it, and everybody said, oh, wonderful, this is a great idea. Well, not so great. Globalization and happy talk about a peaceful power transition led US policymakers of both parties to ignore Chinese strategic purpose and its national will, those two key elements. By emphasizing the measurable elements of national power, where the U.S. looks comfortably strong, and ignoring the unmeasurable variables, which in Klein's view and mine are a multiplicative factor, not something just to add on. The U.S. let its relative power slip, its national security slip along with it. Going forward, the U.S. will have to use all the elements of its statecraft kit to keep China's strong purpose and strong national will within bounds that the U.S. can accept.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Hillebrand, as a final thought, you've spent years teaching long-term global trends, studying long-term global trends. Are you optimistic? You already answered this in this question, but are you optimistic about the future of liberal democracies as a whole compared to the era where authoritarian powers are gaining upper hand? For example, we saw the collapse of democracy in Afghanistan, and in some other parts, we see trends, nationalistic trends becoming much more dominant compared to having a majoritarian democracies or having the rules of law. You know, countries relying more on national security institutions to deal with threats internally and externally without due consideration of what the people's will or people's opinions are. What do you think?
Well, I'm a man of the Enlightenment, and I think liberal democracy is a wonderful thing, but the idea of authoritarianism goes back to Socrates and Plato, who thought democracy leads to chaos, and a strong philosopher king is the best form of government. I don't subscribe to that, but a lot of people have for centuries. If you mean a China and Russian authoritarian alliance, I don't give any credence to that. If you mean China, sure, there is a possibility that would be a global hegemon. You could get there by war or by clever statecraft or by a failure of national will in the West. I also think there's a possibility China will fail in that quest because of its fragile economic and political systems. If you are subtly hitting at U.S. authoritarianism, I too worry about the rise of socialist and communist thinking in a growing part of the Democratic Party. But following the advice of one of the West's great thinkers, Doris Day, said, "Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera."
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. We'll see what will be will be. But also for the policymakers in the U.S. and around the world who are hedging their bets on how to secure the national interest, I hope they listen to your thoughtful analysis and predictions and various aspects of the issues that you described, mindful of the trends that are happening and being able to take advantage of them for the U.S. to continue to maintain its leadership role in this century. Because I do believe that without a strong leadership from the United States, we will have a chaotic world, and we are already seeing wherever the U.S. retreats, chaos takes predominance, anarchy, terrorism, and forces of authoritarianism. And so I hope that the relevant people in different entities and institutions are courageous enough to take your advice and consider various elements of the U.S. power and take advantage of it in pushing ahead the U.S. to continue to maintain its predominant position of the leadership in the world that's good for Americans, that's good for the world. Thank you very much, Professor Hillebrand, for your time. For our viewers, Dr. Heaven Hillebrand, former professor of Geoeconomics at University of Kentucky, former senior analyst at Central Intelligence Agency, and I was honored to be his student. We had an in-depth conversation on various topics and various issues that are important for us today as well as the future. Until our next episode, God bless you, God bless Afghanistan, God bless the United States, and God bless our world. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.